rating, and there was also a comment in there about not expected to lead to future suspended funds. And while that, again, good for the product, easier for the product provider to say it because that's an expectation, but putting it in personal advice, it really is outside the advisor's control. So moving on, in the second example here, and in the interest of time, I'll move through these a little bit quicker, but have a look at these. But the client's goal was to save for a comfortable retirement, advice on consolidating. They wanted advice on consolidating their existing super benefits, required appropriate super plan, offered investment choice, and achieve capital growth. What the first SOA didn't look at was the client had a couple of had a current employer super fund, and that wasn't addressed as a potential to fund, so it didn't look at all of the existing funds that the client already had, and didn't sufficiently address the other from funds. So there's a number of existing ones as potential to funds for consolidation. So the first case is always look at the existing funds and can they achieve the client's goals. If not, then you look at an alternative. So in talking to the advisor here, the revised SOA explained, drew out some more explanation, and what came out due to some prompting was there was a conversation between the advisor and the client. So this really highlights the importance of including relevant details in the SOA and keeping good file notes. But what the advisor said when we said, well, why not consider the employer fund? The client had actually said, look, I'm not sure how long I'm going to be there. I don't really want to use that as my main super fund. I might be leaving the employment in the short term. So that came through a lot better, and that was really really one of the key things that needed to be in the file. And it also pointed out the increased costs and lower quality to the services provided if using. So the client had Hester and OnePath Super in this case, but what the SOI also pointed out was that the advisor could provide the same ongoing services, and that's one of the things that the client was looking for. Those services could be provided, but because of the limitations in features of using potentially using a couple of the existing funds, that the cost for that would be increased, and the quality of the services that would be able to be provided would be lower. So that was pointed out to the client as well. What's in the next example? So in this case, we're looking at a self-managed super fund situation, a rollover from an existing fund public offer into a self-managed super fund. You can see the examples there. What I will highlight with this one is that with self-managed super funds, ASIC's position is that, and their public stated position is that an SMSF is unlikely to be more beneficial in many cases. So coming from that basis, it's really important to show that the self-managed fund is appropriate and why its features are required to achieve the client's goals. So what we looked at in this case was the client wanted growth of super and control over their investments. The rollover was from an industry fund in the first SOA. The first draft of the SOA recommended rollover from an industry fund into the self-managed fund. What it didn't do was explain trustee responsibilities in detail and penalties for non-compliance with SIS rules. The cost comparison included product costs, but not all of the SMSF costs, so establishment costs, annual auditing, and so on, which are really important in the client knowing that that's a real point of difference between your standard super fund or your APRA-regulated fund compared to a self-managed super fund. So what the revised SOA did was then explained that the self-managed super fund provided greater control and flexibility, but contrasted this with the increased responsibilities and costs. So I put the client in the position to be able to make an informed decision a lot better than they were before. Looking forward and I guess speculating a little bit in terms of the obligations that FOFA will bring, we'll go from a reasonable basis for advice to a best interest test. So it may be that the test to show that advice is appropriate or in the client's best interest, that the bar actually gets raised in that. I guess it's a bit of wait and see as to what the actual details of the FOFA legislation will actually require, but keep that in mind as well, that the bar may actually get higher in terms of demonstrating that advice is appropriate or in client's best interests. And moving forward, just on this last one, we're talking about an SMSF here as well. Again, and there was advice on consolidating existing super into an existing self-managed super fund. What the first draft of the SOA did was not show how the self-managed fund achieved the client's goals better than the non-SMSF super, and didn't explain the SMSF costs and obligations. Again, drawing out the conversation with the advisor in this case, it actually became apparent that the client had actually requested consolidation into the self-managed super fund. So they'd had this fund in existence for quite a few years. They knew what the costs were. They were well aware of their obligations, but that hadn't been captured anywhere through the file. So we drew that out more in the SOA, and it helped to make the SOA demonstrate the appropriateness of the advice in a lot stronger manner. The last point I'll make in terms of these real-life cases is that, particularly if you're working if you've got a paraplan when they're writing the SOA and they're not heavily involved in the client relationship, there may be details that are quite relevant, as we've seen in some of these examples, that don't get transferred into the SOA. So that when it comes to me or reviewing the SOA or the client getting it, particularly when it's just a compliance manager looking at the SOA, there's the whole picture isn't there. So passing on that detail to to your paraplanner and making sure that it's included in the SOA is very important too. So having a look at support tools. Updated SOA template. We've been doing some work on that, so you'll see that up on the website, and we're building those into the various software packages. Improved SOA wizard as well, so the template and the wizard are pretty much going hand. Now, what we've got and what will be up on the website is a super switching advice checklist, and I'll jump onto that on the next page. What I'd highlight is that while we've made some changes to the wizard and the template, really they can only go so far. The main focus needs to be the content that you add to the SOA. So hopefully the examples that I've talked about in terms of drawing out the client's needs and objectives and linking the advice back to those, they're the really important parts. And a SOA template and a wizard can't really do that. You need to tailor those, tailor the advice document to actually show that. We've got also up on the website now, and it should be up today, otherwise it's up by the end of the day, is a one-page guide that summarises what we've talked about today, and that is a guide to super switching advice. So really what I've tried to do there is capture a few of the salient points about how do you demonstrate a reasonable basis of advice, how do you show that you know your client, know your product, what do you include in those two areas in your SOA to make sure that you've got a compliant SOA. We've got a couple of case studies in there and some key concepts to take away as well. So what you've got there is a one-page snapshot of a guide to super switching advice. I guess I'll say compliant super switching advice. What you can do there is use that as a reference tool, or for you or your paraplan or anyone in your team, is to print it out and stick it on the wall next to you. It can be a really good reference guide. This is the super switching advice checklist that is up on the website that you can actually use, put it on your client files or just use it again as a reference, but really goes over a few of the points and just prompts you to ask these questions of the SOA and the client file essentially. And this is specific to super switching advice.